Decoding Learning Differences with Kimberly Lavelle, and this episode is Secret Codes and Dyslexia with Dr. Hurford. Dr. Hurford is a research scientist who has studied dyslexia for the past 3 decades. From this work, he established the Center for Reading Difficulties, the Center for Reading, they've changed their name, a nonprofit dedicated to assisting individuals with dyslexia to become competent readers. Dr. Hurford's mission involves the prevention and remediation of reading disabilities, searching for strategies that will lead to the improvement of remedial processes, and providing educators and parents with intervention techniques regarding reading and learning disabilities. Their Center for Reading has developed procedures to identify young children who may be at risk for reading difficulties, dyslexia, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Just as important, the center has developed training procedures to help children become competent readers. To prevent future reading difficulties, Dr. Hurford used his knowledge of learning and reading disorders to write Secret Codes, a reading curriculum for kindergartners. The curriculum was based on the science of reading. Nowadays we would call it structured literacy, but it was before that term was a thing, and was created to teach reading to all children, but was designed especially to prevent reading failure in students at risk for reading failure. And as we know, what works for the struggling population works for everybody. This is just good teaching, right? Good teaching helps everybody. If you're only helping the top 20%, then you don't have a good anything happening there. So you'll hear about secret codes. You'll also hear a lot about dyslexia in general. The majority of our conversation is really just kind of what's happening nationwide, what we can be doing, what we need to be doing, there's a lot in this conversation. This is an especially good one for teachers to be listening to, but teachers, parents, homeschooling families, everyone is going to get a lot out of this. So have a listen and enjoy. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. All right. Welcome, Dr. Hurford. We are so happy to have you on our podcast today. Can you give us a little bit of background information that kind of what got you started on this journey towards helping kids with dyslexia?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. And thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk to people about dyslexia and help spread the word and information so that more people are aware of what's happening, what they can do to help their kids and students, because that's obviously quite important. But if you'd asked me when I was 4 or 5 what I wanted to do when I grew up, I'd have told you I want to be a scientist. And astrophysics and astronomy were my thing. And I still like those things. But when I got in high school, I found out that people were far more interesting. And so as an undergraduate, I majored in psychology. And when I was an undergrad, I realized what I really like about psychology is that looking at how people change, the evolution of the person as they are a fetus to infant to adolescent to, we never stop developing. I haven't stopped developing myself. But in my doctoral program, I'm a developmental psychologist. We were required to take a class called the Psychology of Learning Disabilities, and everything that I was excited about psychology and science and merging those things together, like information processing, learning, cognition, all those perception and sensation, language, neural processing, all those things were in that class. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is where it's at. And so from that point onward, I've been working in the area of dyslexia. Firstly, really in the science realm, trying to determine, why children who have reading difficulties have those difficulties versus kids who don't. And it's interesting because my work started in the late 1980s. And what we were finding, it was language-based. There are language-based issues. And I think it's interesting because, right now we've kind of have this journey of looking at, decoding and synthesizing and those types of issues, which are critically important to learning how to read, no doubt. But now we have an emphasis again on the language component, which, if you've read much about the simple view of reading, it is decoding or word recognition skills times your language processing skills, your vocabulary, etc. And that lends us to understand reading comprehension. And so if you can't decode, you can't read for the most part. And if you don't know the language, then you can't really comprehend either. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, obviously when you're looking at children who have dyslexia, they have difficulties with decoding and word recognition, no doubt. I mean, a lot of times they'll try to decode the first part of a word and then just guess the rest of it because that's very difficult for them to do. But the flip side of it is the language piece. And I know a lot of people, as an example, let's say they took Spanish in high school. And Spanish is a fairly simple writing system to decode. And so if you read a menu at a restaurant that's in Spanish, you can probably say the words, you can decode them, but you don't know what those words mean because you don't have the vocabulary. And so you have to have both to be able to comprehend. And so anyway, I've been working in the area of dyslexia and reading difficulties for about 40 years now. And I'm at a regional institution where I was the Lone Ranger in terms of doing this type of work, which is really great because we created a center here and I can do lots of different things. Like I've created curriculum to prevent reading failure that's to be used for kindergartners. We've published in the scientific literature. We've written children's books. I'm writing other books for adults. And so I get to do a lot of different things because I'm at a place that allows me to do that. Where if I were at a larger institution, I would be more specified in what I'm doing. So it's, a lot of times people say, why did you stay at, a place like Pittsburgh State University? And the answer is, because of my family. And secondly, it just kind of allows me to do lots of different things. And I enjoy that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that whole journey, and I agree with that initial of people are fascinating. It's like I got a degree in psychology not because I wanted to do anything with it, but because I just really wanted to take the classes. I was like,
Yeah.
I'm going to be a teacher, but I also want to have a degree in psychology just so I can take all those classes because it's so fascinating and I love it.
Well, I
Uh,
think that's really important actually, because, when we look at the reading crisis today, part of the reading crisis is a function of not understanding the science of reading and not understanding what's called structured literacy, the way that we should be teaching kids how to read. And if you've listened to Emily Hanford Sold a Story, which I know a lot of your readers have,
yeah,
that's the issue. That's the issue. And part of the problem is that when we train teachers to be teachers, we don't train them to be scientist practitioners. In psychology, we train our students, even at the undergraduate level, to understand science because you have to be able to read the literature to be the best practitioner that you can be. And granted, teachers don't necessarily need to know how to do research or to read research. But if they're trained as scientist practitioners, then they would be able to examine things like the three cueing system and say, hey, that doesn't make a lot of sense having people just guess at the word. That doesn't make any sense. When I explain things like that, I say, look, imagine you're learning to play the piano and your piano teacher says, okay, here's the first song that we're going to learn on the piano. And they put the sheet music on, the piano and say, well, just guess at the notes. Like, how is that going to teach a person how to play the piano? It makes no
right,
sense, right?
right.
And so learning how to play piano is challenging, no doubt, but learning how to read is more cognitively challenging than even learning how to play piano. And so to tell kids, guess at those words based on the picture or guess on the word from the context of the previous sentences, or guess on the word based on decoding the first part of it. That's crazy, because the English writing system, as all of the alphabetic writing systems, are a code, and the code represents the sounds of our language. And we could go into great discussion about how that, came about, but it is a code, and we have to teach that it is a code. And, even several hundred years ago, when people are saying we can't teach, that it's a code because it's super boring and kids will hate it, it turns out that's absolutely not true.
Yeah.
Because when you tell kids, hey, you're going to learn this code, they're excited.
Yeah.
And when you tell them learning the code means you're going to learn how to read, they could become even more excited. And when they learn there's some utility of knowing the relationship between the letters and the sounds they represent, that the more sounds, the sound letter relationships, the more words you can read, that's even more exciting. So it's just this whole concept of how we should be teaching reading was, and I hate to say such a strong word in science, because we generally don't say words like this in science, but it was wrong.
Yeah.
And people would say, some of my kids learn how to read that way. Yeah, they would have learned how to read anyway. But we're talking about
right.
40% of our kids who are reading below the basic level of the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Reading, which means kids really are very, very much struggling and not comprehending. That's terrible. And we need to change that. No doubt.
Yeah. And going back to your point about teachers as, being able to access the science, like that's always the way you said that really hit home for me, because I've never heard it in that exact way, but that's always been one of my frustrations, is not only are teachers not given the information they need to do a good job, like even as like I was trained as a special education teacher, and I had no clue how to work with any kids with any specific disability. Like I had to train myself and seek out that information because I wanted to and it was important to me, but the district wasn't making me do it. There's no one making me do this. And the training was not sufficient. I learned very basic, broad information, but not really how to teach these kids. And I have that like, unquenchable thirst for knowledge. So like I'm always wanting to learn new things, but then I also see a lot of teachers who get very stagnant, that this is how I've done it, this is how I've always done it. They don't question what they're doing and why they're doing it and how effective is it really. And then also talking about that science, being able to read scientific research, was like, I've never really thought about the fact that, yeah, I can do that because of my degree in psychology, not because of any other training. And I like looking at that stuff. I do find that really interesting. So
Yeah, and I think there are probably a number of teachers who are just like you, who, the district tells them this is the curriculum you're going to use. And so they're using that curriculum, and they're thinking, well, why are some of these kids not learning how to read? Well, that just must be the way it is. Or I don't know what to do. I'll find out myself.
yeah,
I know a number of teachers who now are taking things like the Letters program or Ames Pathway or Keys to Literacy to learn how to do structured literacy, because right now it's a very, very exciting time.
yeah,
And it's an exciting time. And again, the history of it is the science has been there for a while. I mean, for 100 years, we've known some about the science of how to teach reading, with Samuel T. Orton and Anna Gillingham. And in the last 50 years, the number of research studies that have been done to examine how we should be teach reading has just absolutely blown up. I mean, it's unquestionable how we should be teaching reading. We should be teaching that the letters represent sounds. It's a code, how to decode them. Other aspects as you get more complicated into learning how to read, but we know how to do that. And I think that merging, psychology has a lot to offer education, because, we have courses on learning. We, in a lot of, courses in education, we have classroom management. Well, how do you do classroom management without understanding operant and classical conditioning that leads to how you modify behavior. So I think there's a lot that psychology has and could contribute. And if I were in charge of, education, there are a number of psychology courses that I think people would really benefit from, because for the teachers who are listening today, your job is more demanding and challenging than ever before in the history of humans. Because of, IDEA and the Education for All Handicapped Children Act that was signed into law in 1975, all children deserve a free, appropriate public education. When I was in school, I graduated in 1977. So 1975 was when that law was enacted. We didn't see a lot of kids who had disabilities in classes. They weren't allowed to be in classes. And the whole notion of the least resistant environment, restrictive environment, sorry, that was not a thing. And so, those teachers were working mostly with regular education students. Today, most teachers have at least 25 to 50% or more of the children in their class that are either English language learners, or they have an IEP or a 504 plan, or some children who haven't been identified yet. And they're dealing with all this stuff by themselves. And so for the teachers who are out there still teaching, thank you, because the only thing that's keeping us from being a barbaric kind of society is teachers. They are teaching children about knowledge and the things we know and how to help them become decent human beings. And so it's hard to be a teacher today. And granted, to be an effective teacher, you have to know so much. It's sort of like, what kind of things do you have to be to or know to be a parent? Well, if we look at all the various issues that can happen, no one would be qualified to be a parent, right? You learn as you go, right? And a lot of parents out there are like, that's right, I learned as I went. I discovered my child was struggling with reading in kindergarten or first grade. And when I went to school, like, well, let's just give it some time. We'll see what's going on. Maybe they're just not developmentally ready for it. It's like, that's nonsense. It's total nonsense. And that becomes the way to fail model, right?
Yeah.
So it's just really complicated today to be a teacher. So I really do thank teachers. I believe in teachers, and I want teachers to know that we're interested in supporting you, at the Center for Reading, and a lot of people are. We want you to have this information. Emily Hanford's Soul the Story was out there to say, hey, you guys were right. You guys who are teachers are saying, hey, something's not right here. Yeah, you are 100% correct about that. And there is a way to teach reading that is essentially going to teach greater than 90% of kids to be at least basic, on the basic level on the NAEP in reading, or better, maybe 95% or greater, rather than the 60%, right? So
yeah, and I think that her podcast, that Soul to Story podcast, like, it did so much to bring so much awareness of, this is the research, these are the stories, this is the experience, we can do better. And like, it just brought awareness to everyone, to force that conversation, to force people to really look at what they're doing. And it really, I feel like that's one of the most important, most impactful, beneficial things that have happened recently. Like,
yes,
I'm very grateful for her podcast. Like,
yeah,
I feel like that's the most, I don't know. And I think it's maybe because, we're in the education field and we care so much, but like, I feel like it's the most impactful podcast that exists. Like, I love it so much because of all of the awareness and everyone always saying, have you heard it? Have you heard it? Have you heard it?
right.
Yeah.
I agree. And, the history of it is that really we've had this science, and the science has really exploded in this area. So we know what to do. In 2011, there were 4 or 5 parents in New Jersey who were dissatisfied with the response that their children were struggling in reading. And they said, you know what, I think we need to create this little organization, which they called Decoding Dyslexia. And when I found out about them 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, they were in 47 states and 2 provinces in Canada. So what they were saying was resonating with other parents going, yeah, that's the problem here too. And, so you have that. And then you have the Sold a Story podcast. And
Yeah.
between the two of them, like Decoding Dyslexia has done an amazing amount of work going to state legislators and saying, hey, we need to do something about this. There's a reading crisis here. Here's a way that you can help. And then the way that Emily, she's brilliant. She's a great writer. She's very non-accusatory. She asks the right questions and she lets people speak. And as a function of that, people didn't feel threatened. So teachers are like, yeah, I agree. I noticed that myself. I just didn't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
And now that I'm learning different strategies, it's helping my students. And so I think we're getting to a point where we're hitting what we call critical mass, where there's enough things that are happening. We talked about the Mississippi miracle, right? Which in Mississippi, they made the most amount of progress in reading. Granted, they're still struggling with reading, but they were one of the poorest performing states in reading, and they made a lot of progress. Well, it's not a miracle, it's the science.
Yeah.
The miracle part is people wanted to do something about it, right? And in Kansas, where I am, we have the Kansas Blueprint for Literacy, which is Senate Bill 438 that was just signed into law, last April. And it helps to promote the science of reading and structured literacy by saying that structured literacy is what will be taught in schools in terms of kids learning how to read. And it is what will be taught to pre-service teachers before they become teachers. And our Kansas Department of Education has already made giant strides in making those things happen by changing the way that colleges of education are accredited with reading. They have to show they're doing the science of reading and structural literacy, and the way school systems are accredited. And the bill actually creates, in addition, 6 centers of excellence. So there's places where families can go to get help and where teachers can go to get more training. And there's a micro credential, which is actually more of a macro credential, where in-service teachers have to learn structured literacy. So we're trying to solve the problem. And if we can get this to work, because there's many, many players on the team, if we can get this to work, other states will be interested, and then other states will be interested. And then we will have, to a large extent, the crisis kind of solved.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. I feel like we've gotten off of what I was gonna have you talk about, but it's all beautiful.
I tend to do that to people, by the way. So it's not your fault at all.
But tell us more about your Center for Reading and what you guys are doing there.
All righty. Well, thanks. Initially, as I said, we're doing the science piece of it, and we're looking at why kids who were struggling with reading, why they were struggling. And one of the things you do in science is you do training research. In training research, if you have a hypothesis about what the problem is, and then you develop a training module that helps with that problem, that indicates that you probably were correct about what the problem is. It's like if you go out to your car right now and it's not starting, you start generating hypotheses. And you'll hit upon a hypothesis that's the correct one. And you're like, oh, that was the problem. And so in science, we do training studies, not necessarily to help people, but to actually understand what the issue is. In our early work, we were finding success in changing behaviors and getting people to become more competent in some of their reading skills. And then we thought, well, we should be applying that to help people. I mean, that's the real benefit of science. Science exists, basic science exists just for us to understand our universe. And then when we do applied research, it's taking that basic knowledge we figured out and applying it so how it can help people. The microwave oven, how that came about. Well, it helps people because we can cook food faster. We can reheat stuff. It tastes better. It's wonderful, right? But that came through science first. And a lot of things do. And so in the early 1990s, we were going into school systems with our identification protocol, identifying kids who are at risk, and then working with them at no cost 2 or 3 times a week to help improve their reading skills, which we did. But we know that 2 or 3 times a week is not enough. So we asked to create the Center for Reading in 1996, and that allowed people to come after school and during the summer to get additional help. And then that led to something else. And then the point is, okay, we can help kids, right? We can help remediate whatever difficulties they're experiencing. But wouldn't it actually be way cooler to prevent that in the first place? And so I had mentioned to one of the superintendents that was around here. She was a brilliant scientist, biologist. Probably should have been in the classroom. She's just so good. But she was the assistant superintendent in charge of curriculum. And I told her, hey, someday I'm going to write this curriculum to prevent reading failure based on what I know about the science of reading. And that was in the early 2000s, and it's called Secret Codes. And, not surprisingly, it works. School systems that use it, there's a school system in Oklahoma, and this was a first grade teacher who, for whatever reason, she'd been a first grade teacher for 20 years. And for the last several years, 70-80% of her kids were still struggling to learn how to do any part of reading at the end of first grade. And she's like, I'm losing my mind. Do I let them go to second grade? It becomes a second grade teacher's problem. I don't like that. Do I retain them? And if I retain them, what do I do with them? I'm trying everything. And she said, can I use your curriculum? I'm like, of course. I mean, that's what we wrote it for. And the first year that she used it, she went from 70-80% reading failure rate, according to her, to zero. And the second year, zero. The first school that used it, the kids who were younger siblings, the parents were like, I wish this was around when my older siblings were going through this, because these guys are picking this stuff up. Well, I mean, it makes sense, right? It makes sense if you don't understand the science and you understand how writing systems work. We should be able to write curriculum that prevents reading failure. And this is precisely what people should be using, whether it's the secret codes or something similar. We have to teach structural literacy. And, obviously structural literacy is a term that was coined in 2017, and we're talking, 12 years before that. But the science has been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
So that's exciting for me. When I was writing, my wife said, if this works, you have to give it to schools for free. But the issue is there's a lot of things that come with it that I want kids to be able to touch and hold and manipulate. And that's kind of a story for a different, podcast perhaps. But unfortunately, it comes with a lot of stuff that I couldn't really afford myself to give it to schools for free. But, the notion is to give it to schools at the cost so they can use it. And, right now they're spending lots of money on curricula that doesn't work. And, that causes issues. And if we can keep one kid from not going into special education or being retained, that's a huge cost saving to the school and to the child, because we see kids at our center, because we do evaluations here at the center for people all over the United States and some outside the United States. And, when they come here, we also evaluate them on their psychological and emotional functioning as they relate to education. And even kindergarten children have anxiety about going to school because they recognize that they're different from other kids. And every child who goes to kindergarten, the first thing they want to do is learn how to read. Because as 4-year-olds, you see your kids at home, they're scribbling. You're like, what are you doing? They're like, I'm writing. Of course, they're not, but they want to, right? So it's not a motivational issue at all. But what happens is when they get into kindergarten and they can't do these things they desperately want to do, they think there's something wrong with them. Yeah. And so we see kids in kindergarten who have anxiety that morphs into depression in first and second grade. There's some suicide ideation. Actually, some kids are starting to drop out of school in elementary grades. I mean, this is a huge, enormous social problem that is correctable. It's the simplest, easiest problem to correct if people will just get on the same page. And that's what we're trying to do in Kansas. And that's what Reed Lyon and others tried to do with the No Child Left Behind legislation, in the early 2000s, with Reading First, that the wheels came off of that. But when you do something at the national level, it's way, 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 way more challenging. At a state level, it's still very challenging, but much more doable. So I think it's just really an exciting time because people are listening to the scientists. For most of my career, being the Lone Ranger, as I said here, people would say, David, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a psychologist. You don't know anything about reading. Go back to your office and please shut the hell up.
Oh, no.
And, so it's exciting now that people are saying, hey, what's going on here? Yeah, maybe what you were saying about the science of reading maybe is useful. So if you're in a career long enough, sometimes you can see, I've seen many, many, many different things. A lot of the people who are the major players in the field I've got to meet, interact with, and are friends with, and I know what their passions are. And it's just really incredible that now people are listening. But part of the reason why people are listening are parents, like Decoding Dyslexia and parents, and saying, hey, come on, we need to do something.
Yeah.
And then, someone who's a brilliant writer who says, hey, here's what's going on, with the soul of the story. I think those are two, other than the science piece, which is obviously critically important.
Yeah.
Those two pieces have been major issues in the movement forward that we're seeing, and it's going to help kids learn how to read. And it's really should be seen as a basic human right. If you can't read in our society, you cannot fully participate.
Right. Right. Yeah. Totally agree. Okay. Is there anything about secret codes that you think is especially special, different from other things that are out there, other than being inexpensive, which I feel like I get so frustrated because there's all these publishing companies that spend so much money on marketing to get their things sold, and then the districts feel like, oh, well, it's so expensive, so it's better or something. I don't know. They get like they buy these super expensive things that are no good in comparison to things that are super cheap, or even some free stuff that, is just download and print type stuff that exists. And like, you're trying to make things as inexpensive as possible, but then I feel like there's so many districts out there that just don't know. And
Right. I think that's, like the blueprint here in Kansas, we're requiring that pre-service teachers are trained in structured literacy, that in-service training has to occur, and teachers have to achieve the micro-credential by 2028. And the Kansas Department of Education is requiring that administrators who are involved with elementary reading and special educators and support personnel like school psychologists, they all also, when they get their license renewed, must get the seal of literacy that shows that they know about structured literacy. Well, if you know about structured literacy and then you look at a curriculum and like, this doesn't look like structured literacy, then they can reject that. So it's all about education.
mm-hmm.
And, I really don't fault anyone at this particular time, particularly those who are practitioners who care about kids, who got in the field to help kids, and they want kids to learn how to read. It's just that lack of education and there are many places across the United States in colleges of education who are teaching the science of reading, but there's still far too many who are not. And because of that, people don't know what's good from bad, or the bells and whistles from the things that have some real meat. And so that's, I think, one of the places that really needs to change. And I think we're getting there. We will eventually get there.
Yeah, totally. Um, oh, so secret codes. Is there anything about it that's especially different and effective compared to other structured literacy curricula, or is it?
It well, interestingly, when I wrote it, I was not familiar with other curricula.
Yeah,
I I mean, I was basing it on what I thought based on my knowledge of the science of reading. And by the way, I think it's probably important for me just to define what the science of reading is, because I think a lot of times people think, well, science of reading is a curriculum. It's not a curriculum, or it's a strategy. It's not a strategy. When we talk about biology, we know biology is a science. And when we talk about physics, we know that physics is a science. But with reading, we haven't based a lot of what's going on in the practitioner side of it based on the science. And so when we say the science of reading, what that means is what we know about reading that has been vetted through science, not things that, hey, I think this is a great idea. Let's do this, like guessing at words based on pictures and context and the first part of a word. That's not science, because when you do the science, you find out, that's not a good way to teach reading. So the science of reading is everything that we know about reading that's based in science. Neurological processing, how that works, how people use vision to read, all those types of things. And so from the science of reading comes the methodology to teach reading based in science, and that's structured literacy. So I just want to make that kind of point, because I think there's still a lot of confusion about, what is science of reading? That's what we should be using in schools. Well, yeah, but from the science of reading is what we should be using in schools, right?
right.
So for me, one of the things that we know is when you look at various writing systems, some writing systems we refer to as transparent writing systems, like German and Spanish and Finnish and Italian and Greek. They are transparent writing systems. And what that means is their decoding system is very simple, that they have the sound that is represented by a letter. Only one sound is represented by that letter. Not like
Yeah.
the writing system in English, where that one letter can represent many sounds, and a sound can be represented by various letters. And it's just complicated. Like the long E sound, for example, there's 9 different ways to spell it. Well, in Spanish, there isn't. It's the letter I. And for the most part, like in Spanish, it is always the same. I mean, there's some nuances, but mostly the same. And kids who are struggling readers, they're less likely to struggle as much. They're going to struggle with the decoding piece, because that's the kind of the hallmark of dyslexia, is that decoding piece. But in a transparent writing system, the decoding piece is so easy that they struggle a little bit, and then they go, okay, I got it. And there are fewer things they got to know. And so they become if you look in the German literature, for example, they talk a lot about slow readers. They don't talk about non-readers like we do. So when you look at a writing system that is very complicated, like ours, then it becomes like, well, how do we go about teaching reading in the first place? What should it look like? And for me, and some people will disagree with me, and that's okay to disagree. But for me, it's like, let's make the English writing system a transparent writing system at first. And let's not talk about letter names, because letter names are not even necessary to know to learn how to read. You don't need to know the letter names. Now, granted, yes, we do want kids to know the letter names. So in the secret codes, we get to that about 3/4 of the way through the curriculum. But initially, we don't talk about letter names. In fact, it's hard for teachers not to. So some teachers have a little penalty jar. They have to put something in their jar when they talk about, because the students will be like, hey, you said, they'll call them out on it, right? So what we do is we present one letter, and then we do a lot of different things with that letter, and we tell the sound that goes with that letter. And then the next day we review that letter and add another letter. And then the next day they come in, we review both those letters, and we add another letter. And we're showing them words where that letter is. Like a lot of times in curricula, you'll see when they talk about, say, the short A sound, they'll say ant, apple, right? But we want to show them that it's in not just the first position, but in the medial position and the end position, right? So they know it can be anywhere. And so what we're doing is teaching them how to be little decoders, right? And so on the 5th day of the curriculum, we're actually having them with those 3 letters that they've learned. One is a vowel and 2 are consonants. We're having them decode words. And then they get super excited because like, oh my gosh, I'm reading. And then they learn there's some utility in learning that letter sound relationship. Tell me more so I can decode more words and read more words. On the 7th day of the curriculum, we want them to know that to be able to be good decoders, they have to understand that it is a code and they have to use it to encode. So we introduce spelling and they're writing every day, they're writing those letters and saying those letter names as a rehearsal strategy. Some people call it multisensory technique, but we really refer to it for what it is. It's a rehearsal technique to help them remember it. And by the end of the kindergarten year, they've read 550 different words and spelled all of them. And they've read a number of different sentences and paragraphs. So I'm not familiar with other curricula, but my guess is, what major curriculum companies are going to be doing is pivoting, just like with Heinemann, they added in phonics, which is, even when we talk about whole language versus phonics, that's not even what we're talking about here. Yeah. Phonics is part of structured literacy. It is not all of structured literacy. So when people say we do a little bit of 3 cueing system and we throw in phonics, it's like, yeah, that's still not going to help you. Right. You got to teach kids how to do the decoding, and then you have to deal with morphology, the meaning of words, how to connect them together, punctuation, all those types of things kind of have to coalesce and come together. So
yeah, not teaching the bad habits along with the good information. Yes. Like,
yeah, and see what's important too is what we're talking about is how to teach reading acquisition, how to teach reading in the very beginning. You have to teach it that it's a code, no doubt whatsoever. Yeah. Now later on, as you are reading, you will learn the meaning of words based on context. So no one is saying in the scientific literature, kids shouldn't be writing, kids shouldn't have stories read to them from the teacher because you're learning about morphology, meaning, and just the appreciation of a story, right? All those things that they were trying to do because they thought that kids learning the code was boring, a lot of those things actually turn out to be pretty good stuff, right? You cannot teach it in the beginning though, because if you have kids guess, then that's what they do. They guess. Right. When they get to a word they don't know, they guess. They have to go in the mode of decoding and synthesizing. Decoding meaning you're decoding the letters into the sound. Synthesizing meaning you're combining or blending those sounds together to read the word. And then, we want to do that with the secret codes on words that are highly likely that they're already in their vocabulary.
Yeah.
But we also want to teach vocabulary, right? Yeah. So there's lots of moving parts here, but, when we're talking about some whole language notions, like how do you learn, can you learn new words from context? Absolutely you can, right? But we don't want to teach that in the very beginning because we don't want them to use that as a strategy to acquire how reading works. But later on, like when you come to a word you've never seen before, you're like, oh, well, sort of sounds like this what is the word, right? But based on context. And then, of course, if you really want to know, it's probably a good idea to use a dictionary, right?
Yeah.
But you can get the context sort of a word, but that's not something we should be really focusing on, and probably till more like 2nd or 3rd grade, where they already have their reading skills pretty well in place. Then you can start thinking about other ways to acquire the meaning of words. And I'm not joking about a dictionary. It was kind of interesting when my oldest son was in high school. I had to get something out of his glove compartment in his car, and there was a dictionary. And he goes, "Yeah, I look up words all the time." I'm like, "Wow! I mean, that's amazing. I didn't tell you to do that. That's pretty amazing. You figured that out on your own."
That's awesome. I love that. um, the other question I had about secret codes is it a curriculum that would work for homeschooling families?
Absolutely. A lot of homeschool families, you know, they're not experts a lot of times.
Yeah.
They see the benefit of teaching their students at home, and a lot of homeschool parents doing a fabulous job. We have students here at Pittsburgh State University who've been homeschooled, and they really are quite excellent students. I mean, there are some people who homeschool their kids that really have no business doing that, but I really don't know that that's, I think that's the way people think about it, but that's not the real part of it.
Right, right.
But for people who are homeschoolers, um, absolutely, because this is how all kids should be taught to read. And whether it's the secret codes or something very similar that gets into structured literacy, that's how you teach kids how to read, and they'll become competent readers, even those who have dyslexia. And dyslexia is one of those spectrum kinds of disorders. We have kids who have dyslexia, no doubt, and adults who have dyslexia, but are relatively competent readers. They just struggle. It takes them longer. It's harder for them to do that. And then it runs the gamut to people who have severe dyslexia, which we've seen at our center. We've seen some extremely severe cases of dyslexia. But if you give students structured literacy, which is how kids with dyslexia absolutely have to be taught to read, it actually turns out to be how we should teach all kids how to read. But yeah, the notion is my desire when I wrote it was that when children were exposed to the curriculum, even if they had the neurobiology or the genetics to be struggling readers, that this would make sense to them and they would get it. And even though they would probably still struggle some, that they would have at least the tools to deal with it. And like right now, most of the time parents, they're like, well, what do I need to do to get my kid ready to learn how to read? Well, read to your kid all the time. That's important. No doubt. That's not going to prevent reading failure, but that gives the context of why reading is important. It can be enjoyable. Uh, Speak to them a lot with a rich language construction. So you're building that vocabulary, which is critically important in terms of reading as well. And really, if you're going to talk about, letters of the alphabet at 3 or 4 years of age, refer to the sounds of the letters, not the names of them. And we're not expecting kids at 3 years of age to be readers. Some are actually, but at 4 years of age, they can start to learn how to do the mechanics of reading. And so they're ready for kindergarten to actually do the reading. I mean, for me, what's exciting, and I'm not really Pollyannish about this. I mean, I am very optimistic, but in reality, we have the knowledge to teach nearly every child to learn how to read. And so to correct that, even in really great states, they still have 32% of kids are reading below the basic level. Anywhere near 32 to 40%, just absolutely terrible. If we can get that down to 5% of kids are reading below the basic level, okay, then let's figure out those 5 kids, right? But also, when you give them the tools in kindergarten, then you have fewer kids who are struggling in first grade that we need to deploy other types of resources to help them, either in special ed or 504 plans, or just to do other things to help them become competent readers. There are a few of them to work with, so we can take the meager amount of money school systems are getting from IDEA, from special education, that meager amount they're getting, to do more with fewer, because we don't need to do more, right?
Yeah.
And I should mention that, I think that, special education is probably one of the most significant and important things that we've done for children in the United States. I mean, there are several things, obviously, civil rights, women voting, Title IX for women to participate in sports equally, to learn about themselves through sports, learning that what you put into something is what you get out of it, which is a very important life lesson. So I think that the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is critically important. But from the very outset, the Congress said we're going to pay 40% of the education of children to be added on to states to use in special education. And they've underfunded that every single year since. And right now it's so underfunded, it's under 13%. Well, you can't ask school systems to do more and more with less and less, because already a classroom is so challenging for a teacher because of the diversity of the types of issues that person has to deal with: psychological and emotional, psychiatric issues, educational issues, all those types of things that teachers have to deal with. And they're saying, oh, by the way, yeah, you need to differentiate instruction for every kid, which they're supposed to do now. And we're not going to give you a para to be with this kid. I mean, it's challenging, right?
Yeah.
We absolutely have to get Congress to fully fund special education, provided that we have a Department of Education that has the Office of Civil Rights that will make sure these things happen. So, for those of you who think, yes, we should get rid of bigger government, just remember that the government, Lincoln's notion of government, is for the people, by the people, of the people. Who is the government? We are the government. I'm a state employee. I'm a part of the government. I'm here to help kids become competent readers. We have to understand that for most individuals who are in the government, they're there to truly help and make things better. If we eliminate the Department of Education, for example, then we're going to lose the Office of Civil Rights that requires states to do what needs to be done. We're just hoping the states will do what they need to be done. They might put funding in other areas and not special education. So you need to fight to keep special education alive. Obviously, the law will still be there, but how it's implemented may not necessarily be there. I don't want to necessarily get on a soapbox, but I care about kids.
Yeah.
I mean, our kids truly are our future. And if we're not able to teach kids how to read, then they're less likely to critically think. They're more likely to succumb to the nonsense that's put out there. They don't know how to critically evaluate data. Should I get a vaccine or not? Should I get a vaccine? Is there really a thing going on that's global climate change? California is experiencing those things right now. So is Florida. I mean, lots of things we have to be able to read to understand. We can't rely on someone who is not there in our best interest to tell us what they think, because that may not be in our best interest.
Right. Yes. 100%. Yes. All right. I wanted to wrap up, but I definitely want you to share about your books that you have written, and kind of let everybody know that those exist. I think they seem really sweet, and beneficial.
Yes. Well, thank you. Nearly everything that we do at the center is either to contribute to the scientific literature or to help use what we know from the scientific literature to help people either understand what dyslexia is, what to do about it, or to help their child or student become a competent reader. So this is about 10 years ago. I had this idea that I needed to write a children's book to help children know, hey, you're not alone. Because a kindergarten child does a lot of self-comparison. They're like, I'm excited to learn how to read. And some of these other people, hey, they're getting it. I am not. And maybe I'm not very smart, which is not the case. And maybe I need to try harder, whatever the case may be. They put a lot of that onus on themselves.
Yeah.
Like our president here at Pittsburgh State University, Dr. Daniel J. Shipp, has dyslexia. And I interviewed him I'm the co-editor of Perspectives of Language and Literacy, which is an International Dyslexia Association journal. and I interviewed him. And part of the interview, he was talking about his childhood and saying he felt like he was disappointing his parents. And his parents didn't know what was going on. They took him to the doctor, like, is this kid's head okay? I mean, what's wrong with this kid? We have two older kids that learn how to read. And now this kid, what's up? And, it breaks your heart to hear those kinds of stories because that kids are doing that to themselves.
Yeah.
Um, and, they seek the teacher and their parent, like, help, I don't know what to do. And they don't have the answer. So we want to write this children's book so that children knew what they're not alone. And there's other people who have it. And then it's a brain-based kind of issue. And it's okay to have a different type of brain because we all basically, all our brains are pretty much the same. But there's some nuances. Like the reason why you want to be a teacher is because you love kids, want to help kids, and you can take a concept and modify it 50 different ways until a kid understands it. Where if you put me in a classroom, I would be terrible. I I would be looking out the window thinking about what's the next thing I need to do in science, and kids are running out of the classroom. It'd be absolutely terrible. So I highly respect teachers and the skill set. And I also knew that parents didn't know much about dyslexia, and they would have to read the book to the child. And by reading the book to the child, they would learn that their child is among a great many children, millions of children in the United States who have dyslexia or struggle to learn how to read. And their kid is not a freak or a problem. It's not their fault. It's just a genetically based issue, the way the brain was built, which is A-OK. And there's ways that we can do to help them. And originally the books were written for a girl and a boy. And I wanted to write for a special book just for girls, the similar content, except for the characters are a little bit different. But most of the books, the time I wrote them, children's books, 80% of the main characters are male. And I just don't think that's right. Since then, it's now between 60 and 80%. But we need girls to understand that they are in control of their own future, that they don't have to be tied to a male to have a good future in their life. They can be independent on their own. And so it was important for me that girls know, hey, this is something that happens to girls too, and that this is something that's just for you, your book. It's for you. You're a girl. It's yours. And then a couple years later, I thought, well, we really like to have a book for kids of color. And I was in Arkansas, and they're like, hey, we're the book for the Black kids. And so we wrote those two books. So we have 4 versions of it. And then we have 4 additional versions that are all translated into Spanish. And then someone asked me a while ago to write a book on dyslexia. I'm like, look, read all these books. I mean, these are wonderful books. And she said, no, you do a good job of telling the story of what's happening. I want you to write your own book. And I'm like, okay. I mean, if you've written a book, because I have a textbook in statistics, it takes a long time to write. And financially, you're doing it for fun because you're not doing it for the financial benefit for the most part. I mean, if you're a great author and people read your books, yeah, probably you can make some money off it. But it was also during that time when people, basically said, you're a psychologist. What do you know about reading? Just go back to your office and be quiet. And it was very cathartic for me to write them. And it turned into right now it's a 7-volume series. The first 2 that I wrote, My Special Love of Special Education. So I wrote volume 5 and volume 6 first, and they're able to be published. You can get them either on Amazon or at Jet Publishing, and that's JETT. JETT stands for my kids' names plus my son-in-law. So that's where Jet comes from. And otherwise, it'd just be Jet with JET. But anyway, jetpublishing.net. And volume 5 is on the history of special education, which I absolutely love. And I think to understand special education, you need to understand the history and the context and the cases. Like I'm working with a person right now who wants to go to due process and get a lawyer. And I'm like, Well, here's the deal. You can do that. You have the right to do that. There's some steps you have to take before you can based on IDEA. But the fact of the matter is, if you get a lawyer and you go through due process, you're probably going to lose. It's going to take a lot of time. Your kid may even age out, and you're going to feel terrible, and the teachers feel terrible. Everyone, it's really kind of a no-win situation. It really is.
Yeah.
If you want to have an effect, call your state Department of Education, say, I think my school system is out of compliance with federal regulations. 80% of the time, you're going to get some benefit there. So, those types of things I think is important. And then volume 6 is about how to use special education to help your child. And it goes through what standard scores are, what standardized tests are, how to interpret them, what they mean, the process of going through your child being evaluated for potential inclusion into special education, how to engage in the first IEP meeting. Because I think a lot of times parents are like, oh, we're going to have this meeting. We'll figure out what's going on when we get there. And they find out they're signing their kid's life away. The number one, when you look at IDEA, and if you look at the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, the number one person listed who has to be on the IEP team are parents. Because Congress knew, and they were wise about this. In their wisdom, they said parents have to be absolutely involved with the IEP process. And so we're listing them number one, first and foremost. So they have an enormous amount of power to contribute toward the IEP process. Most parents don't know that. And so I wanted them to know that their first IEP meeting, they absolutely have to be ready for it. And I tell them how to be ready for it. And that's in volume 6. Because, there's a difference. I know I'm going a little bit further than you wanted, but
It's fine.
There's a difference between the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now IDEA, the law of it, and the regulations that were developed as a function of the Department of Education. So, for example, there are school psychologists out there who I've heard say, I don't have to give the evaluation report to the parents before the IEP meeting. That is absolutely unequivocally a false statement. And the reason why it's a false statement, because they can say, well, I've never seen that read. I've never read that in the actual law. Yes, it's not in IDEA. But if you look at the regulations that are based on the law, the regulations say, and the law actually says, that a parent has access to their child's academic records at any point that they request them. And they have to be given to the parent in a reasonable amount of time. And I want parents to have access to the evaluation report before they go into the IEP meeting so they know what the school psychologist is thinking, and they can actually study that based on the other chapters in the book on what that all means and when they should be asking for. And then once you're in the IEP meeting, if the child is eligible for special education, what should IEP goals look like for reading? Because in my opinion, the IEP goals for reading have been an under representation of what should be occurring. For example, if I held up right now a piece of paper for you to read, and I redacted 90 or 10% or 20% of the words, which is reading accuracy at 90 or 80%, and said, hey, can you read this? You'd say, I can read the words that are there, but I have no idea what this is about. Right. If our IP goals are word accuracy at 80 or 90%, that kid will never become a competent reader. So the IEP goal has to be above the 25th percentile in terms of standardized testing and reading, because that's guaranteeing some level of reading. I know some of the people who may be listening to this who are special ed may say, hey, right on, that's right, we should be doing that. Or like, oh my gosh, these IEP goals are going to be really challenging now. Yes, they should be challenging. Because, again, if we look at the history of special education, the Rowley case, basically said, in terms of an IEP, you just have to show marginal at best progress. That's fine. The notion, as Rehnquist said, was to actually get students with disabilities in the door, not necessarily to educate them. I'm like, what? That's craziness, right? And so Andrew F. Case basically said that de minimis or just barely making progress is unacceptable for special education. Now, has that had an effect in terms of court cases? It has not, but that's the expectation. And I personally believe if you want to have an effective IEP situation, we have to work together. And parents have to work with the educators and the administrators. And the administrators and professionals have to work with parents. Now, granted, a lot of school psychologists who are out there doing the evaluations, they're there to help their student, because a school psychologist exists to help children learn and to help teachers teach. That's their goal. And so if you're a good school psychologist, then the evaluation report is going to be how we can help that student learn and how to help that teacher to teach that child, right? So a lot of things, we just need to work together. We need to work together. If we work together at the national level to solve problems, we would solve the problems. We wouldn't just be fighting and calling each other names and saying you're wrong and stupid and you don't know anything, because neither side is that true. They just have different ways of looking at things, but we have to work together. And no place is that more true than an IEP team have to work together for that child.
Yeah, totally. And like you're saying, it's so much more immediately effective if we can get the IEP team all working together than the long drawn out due process. And
Right.
like the kid is suffering that entire time, no matter what. And everyone is anxious and upset, and it's icky.
Yeah,
So
it
yeah,
is.
anytime we can get the IEP team to actually be a team and work together and make sure everyone is remembering why we're there and our
Exactly.
goal, that put any ego stuff aside and just what does this kid really genuinely need to be able to read, or whatever they are needing. Yeah, totally.
So true. Absolutely.
100%. All right, Dr. Hurford, we got to wrap up, but I have really enjoyed our conversation today. I kept thinking in my head, like, preach. So
Right.
thank you. I
Well,
loved having
thank you
you
for
on.
thank you for the opportunity. It's it's sort of like it's in me. It's got to come out now. So
I hear you.
the more people who learn and become educated and can help their children or their students, the better off we are as a nation and as a people. So we'll be much happier as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.